So, Chris.
Last time I went to was 2019, which was the ecological conference in London.
So, okay, yeah, thanks. Just keep stressing that. Oh, no. No, just go up and... Sorry. Yeah. All right, okay. So... Okay, that's okay. There's no problem. On all day, his home slides on all that time. Right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our next session. And we've actually got quite a tight program. By the way, in terms of the program, if you can just add 15 minutes to everything and delete Neil Dufty, then you've got the program. So we're going to have this session on fauna management. Now, in particular, Rod set the scene very well about fauna management in linear reserves. And we've now got some specific case studies and initiatives that have been carried out in terms of fauna management. And our first speaker is Dr. Chris Lamotti from Transport for New South Wales, and Chris is going to present on microbat management guidelines. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Neil. All right. So in December last year, we released our microbat management guidelines, which were, I'm going to say, what, about technically 8 or so years in the making, longer than I've been at Transport. We had it's a long road in getting a decent set of guidelines out, and hopefully everyone will find these ones decent, but we're always aiming to feedback. So let's get into it. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where we gather today. Here in Sydney, these are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders both past and present. So why do we need guidelines for dealing with microbats? There are 3 threatened microbat species that live in our structures, which I'll introduce shortly. Any works involving structures, such as replacing old bridges or essential maintenance, can impact these microbats. As you can see from the map to the right, these species can be found over the entire eastern coast of New South Wales, as well as inland. Managing microbats in a structure has a few complications around timing and mitigation measures and management plans. And the first of the microbats is southern myotis. It's the only species that breeds in transport structures. They have 2 breeding periods a year, which can stop works for upwards of 7 months if not adequately planned for. And then there's the little and large bent wing bats. These don't breed inside structures, but they do migrate into maternity caves once a year. No, I'm not going to read that entire tiny table out loud, don't worry. In the table, the table's in the guidelines, and the guidelines are in the biodiversity section of the Transport for New South Wales website. You can check them out whenever you like. This slide is just to say there's a lot of different places in our structures, both concrete and timber, where we found both species of microbat. Any structure that's sufficiently tall and wide enough with sufficient clearance that doesn't have smooth surfaces and isn't frequently exposed to water or rain, yes, water is rain, could have microbats inside them. And as I said on the previous slide, if we don't find them in time, that could shut down the project down for months, for the entire breeding period in a worst case scenario. So what do the guidelines do? The guidelines identify what sort of structures might be suitable habitat for microbats. They explain what evidence of microbats might be present near to or around a structure, and they help determine what the survey requirements might be. There we go, it is a bit sticky. The guidelines then help determine how the project can potentially avoid impacts to microbats, or if a specialist needs to prepare a microbat management plan. So this is the microbat assessment flowchart. I'm going to break it down for you over the next couple of slides, and we'll go through it step by step. It's not as bad as it looks. It really is a bit sticky. I'm pressing 2, 3 times? No? 4 times, there we go. Okay, looking at the first half of the chart, let's go to step 1. Okay, are there any historical records, such as Bionet survey records or an old microbat management plan for the area where the work's happening? Yes or no? If no, the project proceeds along its normal planning pathway, subject to unexpected finds procedures. If yes, then we go on to step 2. Is there any evidence of microbat use? Can someone from the project team look at the structure and see if there are any signs of microbats? Figure out if they'll be disturbed by the project that's planned. We've got a couple of sections to help with that, and I'll take you through what that looks like on the next slide. But for now, if you can fully inspect the structure and discount it for microbat presence, or determine that the planned activity won't disturb microbats, great. Proceed along the normal planning pathway, again, subject to unexpected finds. But before we move on to step 3, let's just take a look back at what's involved in assessing a structure for signs of microbats. So one of the early steps in the guidelines is for an engineer or an environment officer, not an ecology specialist, to take a look at the structure in the planning stage, and we're making a short series of videos explaining this process as part of our training package that will go with this, with these guidelines. So we have to take a look around the bridges and look for discoloration or staining or cracking in the structures. Could microbats be present in any of these pictures? The answer is yes, they're all from microbat management plans. Is there a musty animal smell? Is there any guano? Can you see any parasitic bat flies? Lovely little things. Can you hear any squeaking in or around the structure? And finally, the most definitive indicator of microbat habitation is microbats. There we go. Yeah, seeing microbats in the structure. All right, so we've inspected the hypothetical structure. We found evidence of bats, more or less. Yes, there is evidence of microbat presence, and the habitat is going to be impacted, so we're going to move to step 3. We engage an ecologist to survey the habitat for microbats, inspect the nooks and crannies, maybe use a thermal camera to look in those really hard to reach areas if we couldn't look there ourselves. If microbats are present, or any suitable habitat won't be impacted, we implement the unexpected finds procedure again and proceed along the normal planning pathway. But if microbats are being impacted, we move to step 4, where we get a microbat management plan prepared by an expert. There we go. All right, I'll take you through a few case studies in the guidelines very briefly. You'll have to look at the guidelines for more information, or you could talk to Kate, who knows a fair bit about microbats too. Okay, so Bryna Bridge needed essential maintenance, including the replacement of timber elements. Unfortunately, there were over 120 myotis present in the bridge. The project team, consulting with microbat experts, came up with the following solution: to build a temporary bridge for traffic and for microbats. No, the microbats don't walk across the bridge. With bat boxes in it, and within 100 meters of the original bridge. The original bridge then had the microbats excluded from it. That's the process where an expert goes through and puts plastic or foam or something. Essentially, they know there's no microbats in the bridge, or they use a one-way valve. They can't get out, and thus they can't get in either. No microbats in the bridge. The bridge can be refurbished, demolished without problems. So, and we had new habitat built into the refurbished bridge. So, the next case study is Sportsman's Creek. A new bridge needed to be built, and the old bridge needed to be demolished afterwards. But there was a large colony of microbats living in the bridge. The new bridge had microbat habitat incorporated into the design. While that was happening, there were bat boxes added to the old bridge. We waited for the bat boxes to be colonized by microbots, blocked the entrance, moved them over to the new bridge, excluded the bats from the old bridge, and thus demolition could occur safely. So, hang on. There we go, another sticky button. The last case study I'm going to talk about is Barrington Bridge. This project had a couple of unique challenges. Unlike Sportsman's Creek, the bridges were close enough that construction could impact microbats, and the original bridge needed maintenance before the new bridge could be built. So a scaffold was constructed around the old bridge, allowing identification and inspection of the bridge habitat. The microbat management plans prepared for the bridges classified the activities by order of risk to microbats, and they avoided the riskiest activities during the breeding period of the bats. The microbat management plans, sorry, I'm repeating myself, apologies, really small text a long way away over there. Noise screens limited the impacts of constructions on the microbats, particularly the noise and vibration. And the last part of the solution was to build microbat habitat into the new bridge along with supplementary bat boxes. Okay, so just a little bit of background on the microbat guidelines. They were based on a lot of different microbat management plans that have been prepared over Transport and RMS's history. We got the best ones. We took the common elements through all of them, and we made all of these older sources available in SharePoint for any Transport member to look up, so they can keep informed. And anything new, again, add it to the knowledge sharing website, and keep the knowledge current and best practices. So, getting to the end now, we engaged David, Josie, and Kevin to provide comments and feedback on the guidelines. Brad was also given a chance to comment as a government bat expert. And of course, thanks to everyone in Transport who took the time to review and comment. We sent out these guidelines for review in February and June and recorded all of the feedback on SharePoint. Finally, I'm going to give one shout out to Kate Dallimore and Greg Collins from Northern Region for their ongoing feedback and support. So thanks, guys. Okay, that's everything. Any questions?
Right, we've got just a few minutes for questions. A couple of questions, probably. So no, we've got one there, and then you can just go up to the mic, okay?
Hello.
Right?
Very quick question. How do you know that long-term your population of microbats doesn't decrease when you upset them and move them off a bridge?
That's a fair question, and one that we generally leave to, monitoring and microbat experts. But the last three, we've had consultation with bat experts, and it's a case of we think this is the right thing going forward, but you're absolutely right. It's always worth monitoring, and if it's not working out, then revising the best practice.
Okay. I'll just speak into this thing, do I? Yeah, okay. So my question is about the Bionet Atlas. My experience is it's woefully inadequate. so
Yes, it is.
when people say I did a database search, I couldn't find anything with Run-Log, that really worries me.
So Bionet has a 2-year lag when it comes to roadkill, which was relevant to before this session. But yes, you're absolutely right. It's a case of someone has to volunteer their data into Bionet.
Yeah.
So it's not a case of, there's no records, there aren't any microbats. It's a case of that few times where you look, there was a project that did report the microbats. We work with what we got. Yeah. And if there's records, we'd be remiss to not search.
So that's the other thing I'd strongly urge you, if you find them, to get someone to upload.
Well, that's right. I mean, DPI, the DPI scientific license means that various consultants are required to upload their data. So
theoretically, yeah.
Well, certainly.
What really worries me, very often people will do a search on just what they call recent records, and in a very narrow area.
Yes.
And they'll say, no recent records, nothing within 5Ks, and you know for a fact that whatever it is there.
Yeah. I agree with you there.
So I was going to say, do you use Anabat, passive sonic monitoring, that kind of thing as well, or?
We use it when we can. We typically use consultants, and
so they do that.
We would expect them to upload their records.
They will write a good report.
Yes.
And it's all above board. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But as far as the systemic problems, I think that's a question for DPI, Parks and Wildlife.
Yeah. All right. I'll have a go.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. Please thank Chris for that presentation. Right, our next presenter is Alicia Scanlon from the Department of Planning and Environment, New South Wales, and Alicia's going to speak on precast concrete box culvert and concrete bridge deck bat habitat design trials. That's a long one. And it follows on very nicely from Chris's presentation. So please welcome Alicia.
Thanks. Morning, everyone. Just first like to pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging. It's nice to be here, and really good to follow on from Chris, who's just done a lot of the introductory work for me, so that's great. So I am currently working with Department of Planning and Environment as a Threatened Species Officer, but previously I have been working for 15 years as an ecological consultant, and a lot of that time working with Transport for New South Wales, managing bats in their structures. So that's kind of my background, where I am coming from with this. And I'm presenting this talk basically on some work that we've kicked off at the Department of Planning and Environment. We're looking at creating microbat roosting habitat on new generation bridges and culverts. And this is being presented on behalf of a much broader team of people than myself. We've been working with National Parks and Wildlife Service, and also with a regional manufacturing firm called Swale, who have been helping us with the precast concrete designs. This project's been supported by the Commonwealth Bushfire Recovery Fund, by National Parks, Fire and Flood Relief Fund, and Saving Our Species. So, the importance of artificial habitat. Why do we need to create it for our bats? As Chris has already talked about, and as I can also show you and attest to, lots of bats like to use man-made structures as roosting habitat. Bridges and culverts in particular provide habitat for 3 species in New South Wales of threatened bats. The southern myotis, bottom picture on your left, also on the top right, and little and large bentwings on the bottom right there. They potentially also provide roosts for the large-eared pied bat, Chanalobus dwyeri, but that's much less often, and they've been known to roost in some of the old fairy martin nests. You might have seen mud nests built by birds, which will also be used by other species, not just threatened bats. They like to roost in these artificial hollows with artificial structures, we think, because we've lost a lot of the hollow-bearing tree resource, and we've also suffering increased disturbance to the caves and overhangs that these bats commonly use as roost sites. Through social media, by introduced species like goats. I've seen numerous caves, overhangs getting increased visitation, and it makes them less likely to be inhabited by our bats. They don't like to be disturbed, and they certainly don't like goats hanging around in their caves and overhangs. So these structures are now an integral part of the habitat for lots of our threatened bats. As Chris talked about, they use all sorts of holes, gaps, cracks, crevices in these structures, both timber and concrete. One of the most common parts of the bridges they use are the expansion gaps, which are where two sections of concrete meet. And they can also use, as I said, the old mud nests of birds. They can be used as permanent or temporary roosting habitat. So sometimes the bats will mate, give birth and raise young, in the case of the southern myotis, we know that. But other times they'll just be used as places to rest during the day, as feeding perches during the night, in between foraging bouts, maybe as overwintering roosts, which is common for the bentwing bats. Sometimes they're used by just small numbers, pairs or singles of bats. At other times there can be thousands using these structures as a roost site. They can also be used by multiple species at the one time. What do they like so much about these structures? That gives them a protection from the elements, obviously, rain, wind and light in particular. It protects them from predators. Usually they're raised above the ground and often they're over water, which reduces that access by all sorts of predators not being able to get to the bats when they're roosting. It gives them an insulated and moderate temperature environment, which help bats regulate their internal temperature. It also is in close proximity to water, which bats needs access to on a daily basis. Otherwise, their delicate wing membranes will dry out. And it provides them with a generally low disturbance regime. These are places that not many people like to go to unless you're a graffiti artist, which is kind of common. I'm sure you've all seen old timber bridges like this somewhere near you or not far from where you live. There's thousands of these spread across the landscape in New South Wales, mostly on larger upper order streams and creeks. But we also get them closer to some of our cities at times. A lot of these bridges were built in the 1950s and 60s and are nearing the end of their useful lives. Many of them were also destroyed or damaged beyond repair in the 2019-2020 mega fires and also the more recent flooding that we've had in New South Wales. As a result, several hundred of these structures are scheduled to be replaced or upgraded across New South Wales. That program's already underway. They're being largely undertaken by local councils or by Transport for New South Wales under their Fixing Country Bridges program. They're also being undertaken by a range of other agencies such as National Parks and Wildlife Service, Forestry, and as I also found out recently, fisheries. These replacements are generally involving the new structures are being replaced as concrete structures. They're not going to be timber structures anymore. And oftentimes they're the most basic structure and the cheapest structure that we can get because so many of them need to be replaced. So at the Department of Planning and Environment, we saw a need to mitigate this huge loss of bat habitat occurring at a landscape scale across New South Wales. And we then designed our Bats in Bridges project, which is what I'm going to talk about today. Bearing in mind this project is only in the early stages, so I don't have a lot of results to show. I'm just giving you an indication of what our plan is. So unmodified new bridges and culverts often are quite unsuitable habitat for bats. What's wrong with them? The majority of them are made of concrete, which these days is made very smooth to stop concrete rot and degradation. But that means bats can't get a good hold on any of the surfaces. They're also being made so that any gaps, cracks or holes are often filled, such as the lift holes. You can see in the picture on the bottom right, there is a drainage hole. That's another area that bats will use as roosts. They're often now filling those and capping those drainage holes. So essentially, often these designs are fairly sterile for bats. And in terms of the National Parks Fire and Flood Recovery Project, they are certainly using bridges that are a modular steel and concrete design. The bridge looks much like this one on the left, steel girders over a small creek with just fairly thin concrete slabs as panels, and there is nothing above those gaps between the panels, so it's open to the environment, not really any room for bats to live. In the picture on the bottom left, you can see I've kind of got a general guideline, but to provide good roosting habitat, the gaps and cracks in a bridge need to be roughly 200 mils deep and about 20 to 30 millimetres wide. And it's ideal if you have unfilled or uncapped lift holes. So we were looking at how we can improve the situation on some of these new bridges and culverts. One of the ways, typically, has been to retrofit, and this is something that Rod mentioned, is something that we can still do on a lot of our old infrastructure, even when we're not upgrading it. And I really like that suggestion that these structures are still having impacts and there's stuff we can do about them. So that's something that I'm keen to pursue there. This technique we know is broadly successful, particularly for southern myotis, which will roost and breed in these boxes, wooden boxes or larger timber boxes in particular. But it's not really known to be successful for the bentwing bats in any great degree. We get them roosting in small numbers, but never really in the thousands as we find them in the culverts sometimes. So the aerated concrete or lightweight concrete box that you see on the bottom right there is another style of design that's been trialled. Bentwings will roost in that, but again, we haven't had them in such large numbers. Correct me if I'm wrong, Transport for New South Wales people, but to the best of my knowledge, I don't know of any projects that have found large numbers of bentwing bats in those boxes. But this design here is a new design that we're trialling, which is replicating those expansion gaps where you can find hundreds to thousands, depending on how big they are, of bentwing bats. There are also, we don't have any knowledge of boxes that target large-eared pied bats, and you remember I said they have been known to roost in some of those mud nests. And up in the picture on the top right is another box that we have that we're going to trial, which aims to replicate that kind of mud nest. So it's basically some lightweight kind of moulded shotcrete concrete. When I first saw it, this is not a design that I had, but the National Parks crew and our regional manufacturer came up with this. I was a bit dubious, but I'm going to show you a video at the end of the talk, which is quite interesting. Anyway, it's got numerous small openings that the bats can use, and inside it's actually got some different chambers. Another box that we're going to trial in our program is by Habitech, and it's a moulded modular construction of plastic but has wooden inserts on the inside, and this is only a new design. So what we're going to do is install at least 3 different types of boxes on 20 structures, and we're going to monitor those quarterly using visual methods, so either eyeballing where we can or thermal cameras where we can't, and also recording the temperature and humidity profiles of the boxes as well as the bridge themselves using some data loggers that we leave in place. And then we move on to sometimes asset managers don't like having things retrofitted to their bridges and culverts. And I know in particular Transport is moving away from a lot of retrofitting, so we need to look at other solutions where that is not an option. And this is one of the most exciting things that I've seen in my years of working on bat stuff. This regional manufacturing firm, Swale and National Parks and myself, we're talking about how we could do this, and basically they've come up with a mould that they pour that is a box culvert section that you see in the picture on the left, and it is poured all as one structure. So the replicated bat habitat is kind of U-shaped channels. They've also wanted to trial a natural rock surface. We thought, what the hell, why not? Let's give that a whirl. And so these structures can be used on box culverts. They can also be poured in situ with a flat concrete deck. In future, I'm hoping to work with more manufacturing companies to try and get them on larger concrete structures. And we can work with different designs. This manufacturer is amazing. So this is what we're going to install on 12 new structures, bridges or culverts. And you can see that the surfaces are quite rough, and they did that on purpose because, as I said before, the new concrete manufacturing techniques makes things very smooth, which aren't ideal for bats. So we're going to try and pair these with our boxes. We'll be doing the same quarterly monitoring using the temperature and humidity data loggers over the course of at least 1 year. Thanks. So, what are the benefits of that precast bat habitat? Basically, first thing, it saves time and there's no need to go back and do retrofitting. So for the bats, what it means is if they've had to have been excluded from a roost site, this basically means they can get back into the structure a little bit faster than they otherwise would have if you had to wait until construction was finished and it was safe enough for you to go back in and retrofit with a box. Also, the new bridge and culvert structure remains intact. I know also I've had a lot of engineers worried about me bolting boxes into bridges. So this removes that entirely. The structure remains intact, undamaged, no loss of structural integrity, and there's no change to the flow capacity of the culverts or the bridges. They arrive on site, these structural elements arrive on site ready to go. So they're part of the concrete that gets constructed in a standard construction methodology. We believe that they'll have a longer life than the retrofitted boxes. Obviously none of this is tested yet, but because they're part of the structure, they're concrete, they should last as long as or slightly less than a concrete structure would normally, which is 30 to 50 years. I think design life is minimum. They are going to be installed on national parks, standard bridges, and in terms of cost comparison in that scenario, the culvert elements come out a little bit more expensive, but the bridge elements are cost neutral, which I was amazed about, and the parkies were pretty excited about. So for them, it's no difference. They can swap in and out those standard deck elements for one that includes bat habitat or multiple ones that include bat habitat with no impact to their project cost. And also, none of these designs that we know have been tested before. So this is early stages, but from what I know about how bats use culverts and bridges, I think I'm quietly confident that we're going to get some good results. I just wanted to run through another example. Thanks. From a Transport for New South Wales project that I worked on, which shows another really simple way of creating bat habitat in a new structure. Essentially, we had a winter roost site in a concrete arch that had large expansion gaps. Over 1,000 bentwing bats were known to use that every year. That had to be removed as part of the Pacific Highway upgrade. Under a microbat management plan, that structure was removed, but there was in the season when bats weren't present, and the new structure was built within a few months. That winter, we had already uptake. The new structure was built with the widened expansion joins, so 200 mils deep, 20 to 30 mils wide in the central portion of those new culverts. And we had bats taking that up. The bentwings were in there within a few months, only in a few hundreds. But by the second year in winter, we had in excess of 1,300 little bentwings using those culverts, which is an amazing success. Really happy with that. There was no cost to the project again in this instance. Basically, it just meant we had to be in there at the time that the detailed design was happening to allow the footprint to account for those slightly widened expansion joints. The last thing is just this video from the monitoring we had of these domes. First monitoring, so this is 6 weeks after the domes were put in. And this is on just after emergence, so maybe about 15, 20 minutes after sunset. You can clearly see two bats checking these out. They didn't come out of the boxes. There was guano beneath the boxes. We didn't see any bats in the boxes, but these bats were roosting very close by and obviously very keen to check these out, and potentially we might find them in there next week when we go back to monitor. I would just really like to thank all the people who have worked on this, my colleagues Anna, the people at Swale, Matt Taylor, and the Parkies. This project will hopefully provide guidance on what artificial habitat options are suitable for which bats. And I'd encourage anyone who's working on bridge or culvert replacements to get in touch and find out how easy it can be to incorporate bat habitat in your new bridges and culverts. Thanks.
thanks very much, Alicia. Unfortunately, we haven't got time for questions there, but if you want to ask Alicia any questions, please do via Slido, and then we can ask those questions in the afternoon session. And also, I'm sure if you go and have a chat with Alicia at lunchtime, she'll answer any questions. But thanks a lot for that presentation. Now, local councils do a lot of work with linear reserves, and we actually have got a few presenters from our local councils talking about some of their initiatives. It's important to understand that local councils manage 180,000 kilometres of minor roads in New South Wales, and also several other council reserves, linear reserves, so they've got a very important role to play. And it's great to see some council representatives from around the state here today. So we've got a presentation now from Hayden Bond from Port Stephens Council, and Hayden's going to talk about managing threatened species within roadside environments. So please welcome Hayden.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. As we've heard today already, well-managed and high-quality roadside environments provide some really important ecosystem functions and environmental values. Particularly threatened species, particularly roadside environments can provide some important foraging habitat and breeding habitat for threatened species. And in this case, we're going to look at the Marnie's toadlet, Wallam froglet, so amphibians, particularly using roadside environments after heavy rainfall events, and also having a little look at some locally significant orchids in the Port Stephens area as well. So hello everyone, my name's Hayden Bond. I'm going to be talking about the roadside marker program we have implemented here at Port Stephens. To manage our threatened species. So basically I'll touch a little bit on the background of the project, how we relaunched the project after we discovered a new amphibian species, and where we're looking to take the project in the future. The project mainly focuses on threatened amphibian species, but it can be, the process and the scheme can be applied to most other threatened habitats in the roadside environment. Today we'll be looking at Marnie's toadlet and Wallam froglet specifically. Port Stephens Council, we'd like to thank a few organisations who, without their help, we couldn't have progressed this project. So it was assisted by New South Wales Government through their Environmental Trust. Local Government New South Wales supported the project through their Council Roadside Environmental Reserves Environment Grant Program. And also we partnered with Hunter Joint Organisation to update their existing Hunter Regional Roadside Environment Marker Scheme. And that incorporated the amphibian category we established from the project and the standing operated procedures for that category. So roadside marker programs have been around for a while now. We implemented a version similar to this program about a decade ago. It did have some limitations, which I'll talk about briefly in a couple of slides. Essentially what a roadside marker program is, physical markers in the ground, in roadsides where there's sensitive environments, so normally threatened species habitat or wetlands, things of that nature. Construction crews or operational staff, when they go to those areas and they need to maintain the roadside or undertake projects, there's a field guide which will correspond to that particular marker, and there'll be a set of standard operating procedures. So the overarching aim of this project was to identify or address some gaps we had with knowledge of how much threatened species habitat we had in the roadside. From those findings, incorporate that into our environmental management system, and then relaunch the updated marker scheme. So just a little bit of background about the project and about Port Stephens. So we've got quite a unique area and some really unique environmental values at Port Stephens. Like all councils, we undertake roadside maintenance, so things like slashing, mowing, weed spraying, and roadside drain maintenance and clean out. We maintain hundreds of kilometres of road reserves. Often these road reserves are intersecting national parks, some pretty sensitive bushland that's habitat for koalas and other threatened species. We've also got a number of coastal wetlands, particularly in the eastern areas and around the central areas there. Yeah, and so we'd identified that we had some gaps, not only in our previous marker program, but just in our knowledge of threatened species habitat within our roadsides. So, yeah, as I'd mentioned, we had a previous program. There was some limitations to it. So it was originally incorporated about 10 years ago. It was prepared externally, so there was issues with it not being locally specific to Port Stephens. Didn't capture a lot of our local species and things like flowering times and that sort of thing. It wasn't integrated with our council's environmental management system at the time, so the big issue there was we didn't have a consistent scheduled training program for our staff at the time. So basically meant staff were generally not even aware that there was a program in the ground. Yeah, so in essence, we had markers in the ground, but they weren't really being utilised properly. So how this project, or the relaunching of the project, came around was we've sort of had a look at that gap in the previous program, but we also had a lot of knowledge and data gaps with how much threatened species habitat we actually had in our roadside environment. So we did have some records of Wallam froglet, particularly occurring in our roadside in a lot of coastal wetland areas. But what really kick-started sort of the relaunch of this program was the discovery of Marnie's toadlet in 2016 at Oyster Cove in Port Stephens. And later in 2017, it was listed as endangered as well. So there was additional weight and sort of legal obligations that could affect our roadside environment without that knowledge of where they were. So basically we realised we had some data gaps and knowledge gaps on whether Marnie's toadlet was even present in our roadside environments, whether the habitat was present there, potential impacts we could be doing through our maintenance program. So yeah, to tackle these gaps, we aim to undertake some surveys of our roadside environment and then capture those findings and relaunch it as a new program or an updated program. So the project had a couple of key steps. So firstly, we addressed those data and knowledge gaps by undertaking some desktop surveys. We engaged ecological consultants to undertake targeted amphibian surveys and vegetation surveys. From this, we identified some high-value conservation locations where we would actually install markers in the roadside. And from there, we decided that a roadside marker program was sort of the best tool to manage that sensitive habitat in our roadsides. So deciding to relaunch the program, one of the issues was at the time the existing marker program through Hunter-Joint-Org didn't have an amphibian category. It had a threatened fauna habitat category, but this wasn't really relevant or didn't really capture the correct controls we needed for amphibians and for aquatic environments. So we created, in cooperation with Hunter-Joint-Org, we created an amphibian category, and we also created a set of standard operating procedures for that amphibian category. So this was incorporated into their regional roadside environmental marker scheme, and then we integrated it also into our environmental management system. So this was mainly to capture that knowledge so that operations moving forward would have that, and also to roll out consistent training through our staff. So these are some of the survey findings we had. So basically from the surveys, we gained some really invaluable ecological data on Marnie's toadlet and Wallam froglet. So Wallam froglet was pretty widespread across a lot of our eastern study site, and mainly present in road reserves where water was accumulating near swamp vegetation. Our Marnie's toadlet was heard calling at 2 locations in our eastern study site and was mainly associated with inundated sandbeds and open swamp forest. So on the right there, it's just an example of some of the mapping we ended up with from the survey. So the green areas, in this case, identify foraging habitat for Wallam froglet. So that's the areas where we've installed markers, and then the yellow areas are areas that weren't identified as habitat, and just the usual roadside protocol is undertaken in those areas. So sort of the outcomes from this project, so we managed to relaunch the marker scheme with a lot of updated information and to try and improve our roadside maintenance and roadside management. We updated and generated new environmental assessments to reevaluate our roadside maintenance activities, particularly now with the new knowledge that we had a lot of threatened species habitat in some of our roadside environments. We've been installing markers in the East Ward currently, so the eastern area has been prioritised in our LGA because most of our sensitive environments are in that East Ward, so a lot of our coastal wetlands, and it's also the area where we have the most activity for roadside maintenance. And we've undertaken staff training to not only increase awareness of some of our roadside environment, but also on how to actually use the marker scheme, so when they turn up to a work site or a roadside environment, how to identify what standard operating procedures apply to their work. So as I've mentioned, we've assisted Hunter Joint Organisation with updating their Hunter Regional Marker Scheme. A lot of these resources are available for Hunter councils through the Hunter Joint Organisation. So one of these resources is the field guide, which we've included. So one of these is the field guide, which includes all the standing operating procedures for those marker categories, and we've updated that and incorporated our amphibian category and the standard operating procedures we created for the amphibians. So some of those controls tailored for amphibians include not undertaking drain maintenance works 4 weeks within 4 weeks of heavy rainfall events, and cleaning machinery for limiting the spread of chytrid fungus. We also have QR codes on the markers, so that's for use from council staff. So if they've forgotten their hard copy field guides, they can scan the QR codes with their mobile devices and get the field guide online, but it can also be applied to contractors and other organisations who are working in our road reserves. So we also identified some gaps originally with our knowledge of locally significant orchids in our roadside as well. And we aim to implement a very similar process with the amphibians to determine what sort of habitat we had in our roadsides, and also to try and generate some standard operating procedures locally for our orchids, so detailing things like our local flowering periods and that sort of thing. We did have some initial orchid data through our Capital Works road program from surveys we'd done on that, and we did have some additional surveys at some identified survey sites planned for the last couple of years, but they've been delayed through bushfire and flooding pretty much at the same time every year, so that's been a bit of a challenge. But we did manage to produce a standard operating procedure for our local orchids in the meantime, and have incorporated that into our field guides. So just to finish up, so the next stage of the project, we're looking to expand it onto other threatened species habitat within our road reserves, particularly focusing on getting those surveys done for the orchids, installing it in the rest of our wards in Central and West, to roll that out further. And we're also exploring geofencing capabilities so that crews can use mobile devices and are notified when they enter marker zones, and also if the physical marker is broken or stolen or hidden or something, they'll be notified they're working in the zone. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you very much for your time, everyone. I don't think there's time for questions, but that's all right.
Thanks very much, Hayden, and congratulations to Port Stephens Council on those tremendous initiatives. Our next speaker is Matt Stevens, who's going to speak. He's from the Hollow Hog, presenting on creating artificial hollows. And the first time I heard about this project, in fact, was watching the Channel 9 news, and maybe some others have also witnessed that news presentation. But we're really excited to have Matt here today. So Matt Stevens talking on creating artificial hollows.
G'day, and thanks very much, Neil, for the introduction. And I'm sure that those of you who've known me before the media interviews know that I haven't changed. So, and I'm looking forward to meeting many more of you today. So yeah, I'm here to talk about hollow creation. So I work in two capacities. Firstly, I work and have done since 2014 with Transport for New South Wales, specifically to do with setting up conservation agreements. So where there's offsets for impacts as part of highway projects, I'm involved in the team. So Rodney talking about the Pacific Highway, I mean, yeah, the stuff that's being done on that project is phenomenal, and what we've been able to be involved in. So we've got about 10,000 hectares that we manage and have found, sourced, handed off to parks, made conservation agreements with landowners. So separately, I developed Hollow Hog. So the Hollow Hog is a tool that you use to carve tree cavities, or effectively, or cavities and hollows for fauna. So that was a separate project. So as part of my day job as a transport officer, I was able to see, go to multitude of properties across the North Coast, and going into these places, and you're seeing landscapes that are pretty much devoid of hollows or in very, very low numbers. And it got me kind of thinking about the issue. I also, in parallel, watched all of the information about nest boxes and the installation of nest boxes, and then subsequently chainsaw carved hollows, which was another technique that was people getting involved in. So that's just an example of a hollow that was carved in a tree, so about July last year. So basically, a cavity in timber, that's what a hollow is, okay? Mostly we talk about tree hollows as being the critical type of habitat that we're looking to replicate or protect. But there's also cavities on ground timber, and separately there's cavities that are in the water, for example, a big log that might be inhabited by a cod, or multiple tiny little cavities in a section of log that will be for crustaceans or for fingerlings of fish. All of these spaces are important. We often just focus on threatened species. I think that we need to focus on all species. I think that's an important thing we need to do. If we look to focus on every species that's out there, we're going to obviously encompass what we're doing with threatened species. So they're important because they provide critical spaces. We know they take a very, very long time to form in eucalypt forest in Australia. Overseas, where they've got woodpeckers and other species, that will carve them out. It's a slightly different story, but it's just as critical. So there's thousands of species worldwide that will use hollows. How do they interact with a hollow? So hollows provide spaces where fauna can do the following. So they're going to rear their offspring, or they're going to roost and hide from predators. Somewhere where they're going to shelter from rain or bushfires, and that's been something which is quite phenomenal, looking at forests that have been burnt and then seeing animals emerging after, you know, the place is burnt to a cinder and there's still fauna there. Where they're hiding? Often they're hiding in tree hollows. They're going to find a source of water. That's a critical thing that a lot of people don't think about as part of hollows in the landscape. So there's been, as far as I'm aware, only one study done in Australia, and that found that, and I think they were focusing their camera on a nest box, but it just happened behind that nest box was a fork in the tree, and there was a cavity there, and all the fauna were going to that cavity to get a drink effectively. So that's a critical factor. Are we losing those types of cavities from our landscape? Place to hunt for prey. You saw that picture of a lace monitor, exactly what it was doing. Finding a space that's warmer, cooler, more humid or darker than the surrounding environment. That's the basics of it. And that's what we're trying to replicate, whether it's with a nest box, a chainsaw carved hollow, a salvage log hollow, or retaining a natural hollow. So the fauna in Australia that use them, we've got 17% of our birds, 2% of mammals, 28% of reptiles and amphibians. That's a phenomenal percentage of vertebrate fauna, you know. And then if you start to put on invertebrates as well, we're talking a huge percentage of our species are either solely dependent on the hollows to persist in that landscape, or they're using it as part of their overall life cycle and habitat usage. So just as examples, that's a Perrin's tree frog, and then you've got obviously budgies, and that was taken in Alice Springs a couple of weeks ago, and then that's a naturally formed cavity that was then pecked and kept open by galahs and other parrots in a suburb in Canberra. So what attributes do fauna look for in a hollow? This was a thing that I thought, everyone's going to know exactly what they're after. We've been researching this forever and a day. There's a million nest boxes out there, all these different designs. We know what they're after. We don't, effectively. I contacted the guys who are the top researchers in Australia on this, in this field, and started kind of posing questions. Hey, you know, do we know whether the distance between the entrance and the chamber is important? Do we know whether there's a bit of water going into a cavity? Is that important or not? You know, so there's all of these different bits of information that we want to find out about. We know that for some species, they want to squeeze through the smallest cavity they can. So something like that. So, you know, you're going to get a surprising number of species that will squeeze through that. The lovely pictures of the Alicia's fluffy little bats, you know, they will squeeze into the tightest possible space. I was with one of the researchers in Melbourne recently, and he said, look, you know, they'll go into a minute space. So I better move on a bit because I think time's ticking along. So nest boxes, we know, they've been done for years. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. They seem to work very well for lots of common species, but there's a few drawbacks with them. If we put them in linear reserves, for example, are we going to go and maintain those things forever? Are they there put only in for a very limited duration after, say, for example, a construction period, and we're only interested in the fauna being in that space during that, and then hopefully they're going to disperse somewhere and find a natural hollow? Don't know, but they do have inherent problems. And so it's not just the installation cost, it's the ongoing maintenance of them. Chainsaw carved hollows, that was the next kind of iteration of this evolution of this process, where people go, they carve off a big side plate off the tree, notch out with their chainsaw, which is a rather dangerous operation by all accounts, the guys trying to do it, and then reattach that plate, screw it all back on, put a hole in it, and that's then providing that habitat. Often done where there's weight reduction on the tree, and then, but not always, as in this instance. Murray Ellis, he came up with a concept of providing the entrance. So drilling a hole in a tree, finding that it's got natural cavities inside, let the fauna do the rest. Fantastic idea. So, hollow hog. So this is the hollow hog. That's what it looks like. It's a small tool, attaches to a grinder. It's all custom made. I spent 2.5, 3 years effectively with an engineer perfecting it. It's all kind of got like down to 0.1 mil tolerances on things to get the thing to work. When I came up with the concept, I thought, why isn't someone already doing this? And it seemed such a no-brainer, such a simple concept. Anyway, 2.5 to 3 years showed me why. And I then subsequently been contacted by probably 10 or 15 different people who've all had a crack over the years at doing this. And anyway, we got it up and running, and it's out there. There's about 50 different tools out there at the moment. There's contractors from Victoria to Queensland that are using it and starting to implement it as part of projects. So the intention is to try and create a large cavity through a small hole. So there's an example, so that it'll end up with a 50mm diameter entrance. So that there is a 5-minute hollow, just in a piece of salvage timber, obviously, but that's the entrance size. And then I can carve out effectively every bit of timber in the centre of that in 5 minutes. And that was the kind of thing. I went to the engineer, I said it needs to be fast, efficient, you know, go through the minimal hole, provide a big cavity and be safe to use. And he said, oh, pretty tall order. But anyway, we managed to work out how to do it. So what we're trying to do is minimise the damage to the tree and provide the maximum cavity size we possibly can for the fauna. So this, just a couple of examples. So that's it in operation over there. That's what it looks like. So what you're seeing, the larger hole on the surface there, is specifically designed so we can modify the entrance of the cavity that we're going to put in. So some species are going to want a smaller hole than 50 mils. So I'll make up a whole range, or the arborist, and that guy, he should be vertical, but he's horizontal. I'll make up a whole swag of these. So this is for microbats, and so the intention is cavities carved in, up, form a chamber inside the tree. This is then attached, and you can see it's scalloped out there. We carve out the bark and the living tissue and attach that into the heartwood or the hardwood of the tree. Year 1, the tree locks it in with new growth, and then it's biologically effectively anchored into that space. So, and from a bat's perspective, or from another species perspective, depending on what you're targeting, it just looks like it's a natural space. Unfortunately, you end up with lots of kind of, you know, entrances that stick out horizontally, which can look a bit odd. But where, you know, once the tree's cambium starts to regrow, it'll just do it. Trees are amazing adaptive structures. You know, they will do, okay, 2 minutes, yeah. So they're phenomenal at what they can do. And so they will adapt themselves to the situation they're in. So I think the thing that is going to be critical to be monitored in the coming years in this is tree health. We know fauna use natural tree hollows. We know that's the case. So why go back, as Rodney said, with a whole range of things? Why are we monitoring the same old thing again? We know they use natural tree hollows. What we need to monitor is tree health, and also how we can potentially modify all the elements of this to target the species we're after. And I think they're going to be the critical things in the coming years. So the implementation of it in your linear reserves, well, there's more examples. So those 200 little entrance modifiers, they're going in this week in a park, regional park in Western Sydney. So, and that's chainsaw versus this method. Applications in sites. So obviously where we've got a wider reserve, as David was talking about, it's going to be better and you've got more opportunity. If we've got narrow reserves, often you'll be looking, that's a tree that's going to be a hazard. I'm not going to touch that tree. There's opportunity still in that situation where you might be able to retain a tree barrel and carve into those structures that are left. So there's going to be multiple opportunities. I think this is a process that's going to develop over time, and it's going to, you know, we'll work out how to implement this in a way that's going to be beneficial. So, yeah, that's it. Fantastic. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Matt. Yeah, just like on the Channel 9 News, that was great. Look, if you want to ask Matt some questions, he's available at lunchtime. Also, if you want to use that Slido opportunity, you can use that as well, because we'll pick up the questions from that. But yeah, another example of a wonderful process that is being used on linear reserves. Now, In the news, of course, has been koalas. Politically, in the news has been koalas, and we're now going to have a presentation about koalas. And I'd like to welcome Brenton Hayes from Transport for New South Wales, who's going to speak about koala vehicle strike mitigation. Brenton Hayes.
Thanks, Neil, and thanks everyone. Great to be here. This is my first rec forum, and excited to be here in Gadigal country. So, as Neil said, talking today about koalas, unfortunately based around koala death. So not so happy as Matt's presentation, but something that we need to address. The site, so I've been in the Transport Biodiversity Specialist team for about a year now. Probably within a couple of weeks of starting, Julie asked me, hey, do you want to come along on this site visit? We're going out to Heathcote Road to check something out, and here I am about a year later still trying to work on this problem, but we're getting there. So what I want to do today is just take everyone through sort of what we've done in the last year at this site and where we're at the moment. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on Gadigal land and paying my respect to the elders past and present, and recognising and celebrating that diversity that Aboriginal people have and their ongoing culture and connection with land. So just a quick overview, I'll give you an idea of what the problem is that we're faced with, the approach that we're taking to meet that problem head on, and then where we're at sort of in a funding delivery stage, and then where we've got to go to next. So anyone that doesn't know exactly where I'm talking about, we're on Heathcote Road, which is in the southwest of Sydney. Heathcote Road is a fairly long road that goes from Heathcote up to Liverpool in the northwest there. It borders on some pretty large tracts of bushland. We've got, as you can see on the images, on the markers there, they're all koala records. So we're dealing with the edge of a large koala population. And Heathcote Road itself is an interesting one for anyone that's ever driven it. It crosses over the Deadmans Creek, at the Deadmans Creek Bridge, around about where that red arrow is there. And Deadmans Creek is a little tidal creek line that runs into the Georges River to the northeast. And the bridge over the Deadmans Creek is specifically sort of where we're looking at. Now, I think this issue sort of started at a community level. Over the last few years, there's been a number of articles in local newspapers identifying that this is a problem location for koalas. Where the issue stems from, I guess, is likely that we're dealing with a growing koala population around Campbelltown, and those individuals are expanding out across the landscape. And one of the locations where they're obviously hitting Heathcote Road is around Deadmans Creek Bridge. This bridge was replaced about 5 years ago, I think. And one of the problems was I don't think this was actually a big issue at that point, and we're finding that a lot of the roadkill has popped up in the last sort of few years. So nothing was done at that point. So something that we're going to have to deal with in this situation, unlike new road projects, and something that Rod spoke about, is that we're having to sort of deal with an existing road and what we can do in this situation. All right. So, as I said, the community sort of had this one up at the beginning. Once we started looking at it, Transport has done a koala vehicle strike hotspot analysis across the broader New South Wales. And to do that, we use Bionet records, as accurate as they may be. That's what we've got. Looking at this site, in the last few years, it has actually come up as an emerging hotspot. These two figures here show koala records just sightings of the purple and the orange are roadkill, and it's centered, our site is the red, sort of red line there, goes over the bridge either side of the road. So we've got a lot of koalas in the area, and we've also got a little bit of roadkill around that spot. So the approach that we took initially was we need to work out if this site is a viable location. Is it feasible? Can we do something here? We met some stakeholders out on site in around March last year. That involved some local environment community groups, the Ganangara Local Land Council, some members from 2 local government areas, New South Wales government being National Parks, ourselves at Transport and DPE, and then also someone from the Commonwealth Department of Defence. The outcomes of that initial consultation was, yes, this is a good location. We've got a bridge, there's access underneath. What do we need to do next? We got a consultant to come on and give us some advice, and that was really centered around developing this options assessment report. As Rod has probably seen previously, we wanted to know what does this site mean to koala connectivity in the local area, and how significant is this particular location to dispersing koalas. We needed to know what are our options in this location, because we need to sort of weigh up what the best thing is for a number of factors, and also a recommendation of the best option. And we got that report just in December at the end of last year. This site was, well, I mean, it is a challenging site for a number of reasons. There's never going to be an easy site, but land ownership is certainly one of them. There's a lot of defence land all to the west of Heathcote Road, which is the pink. It's Holsworthy Training Base. We've got parts of Georges River National Park in the green there. The Ganangara Local Land Council is the yellow land, and then the orangey colour is, that's some Crown land. And then to make matters a little bit more confusing, we've got 2 local councils that are separated by Deadmans Creek themselves. Anyone that's driven Heathcote Road knows that it's a beautiful road to drive that's also quite treacherous. There's a lot of steep sandstone cuttings. It goes up and down everywhere. In this particular location, we've got steep sandstone on one side of the road that then off the other side of the road it goes down into the Georges River and the Deadmans Creek floodplain areas, so it's really low-lying land, super swampy. Not a great deal of sort of roadside environment, flat land that we can put anything in. And then around the Deadmans Creek, we've got, which is a tidal river, we've got coastal wetlands, and a number of sort of unnamed tributaries that run into that. And they also run under the road as well, so a couple of different culverts. And then W-beams or safety beams quite close to the sides of the road. We've also got a lot of existing fencing. Between our first site visit and the end of last year, there was a lot of defence fencing that went up quite rapidly on one side of the road along the edge of the Holsworthy military base, and you can kind of see it in that top photo there. It runs just on the other side of that Liverpool sign around about the road boundary, which is 30 metres off the side of the road, and it joined up existing fencing to the north, and it goes all the way along, uninterrupted fence, right to the side of Deadmans Creek, and then even juts out just to make sure nothing can get around. So that's something that we're going to have to deal with. We're in consultation with Defence about that. But it does actually offer some opportunities in a certain way. The other constraint that we've got is St George's Crescent, which is to the north of the creek and the bridge, and it's the main access for Sandy Point. So anything that goes in around that location will need to allow vehicle access as well. And of course, we've got biodiversity impacts that go along with any sort of development. So when you need to put fencing in, ideally you have clearing around the edges of the fence so that you can access for maintenance and whatnot and keep that area clear. So any fencing that went in would need clearing, obviously, and weighing up clearing of koala habitat for koala connectivity and roadkill mitigation. And then we've also got the existence of coastal wetlands, which are identified by the Coastal Management State Environment Planning Policy. And I think they're roughly around the Georges Creek Low area where those lines are on the map. Can't quite see that. So what the work that was done by WSP told us is that, yes, the bridge is represents great potential as an underpass for koalas and fauna. But what we need to do is stop koalas from getting on the road in that particular location and guide them towards this potential underpass. So we've got 4 options here. Just briefly, one of the options was all new fencing along the sides of the road. Considering we've got a lot of existing fencing, that may not make a lot of sense. So we've got a second option, which is actually using a lot of that existing fencing where we can and modifying it as needed. Because of the coastal wetlands I mentioned, that represents some constraints. So one of the options was looking at avoiding that wetlands. So that's the yellow option, yellow lines there, which stops quite short of the rest of it. And then another option, just to look into it, was fencing much further to the south, past what you can see there is a quarry. The report recommended that option 2 was probably going to be our best option, which was providing a long section of uninterrupted fence, tying into the bridge, using the bridge as an underpass. So we need some improvements to happen underneath that bridge to make sure that things can get under. And then where we're using the existing defence fencing, making sure that it is up to the standard of funneling koalas to the bridge location and making sure that they actually can't get over it. Using the existing fence has benefits of meaning that we don't need to clear other sections. We don't have 2 parallel fences that could potentially trap things. And then to deal with the access to Sandy Point on St George's Crescent, we'd be planning to put in a koala grid and then fencing right up to the edges of those. So that's, for anyone that hasn't seen a koala grid before, it looks a bit like a cattle grid. The idea is that they can't walk across, but cars and people can still get across. And then, as I mentioned, we need to do some work underneath that bridge. Right now, it's really just it's got scour protection under there, so we need to do some stuff to make sure that, and then talking about all access, dry access requirements. 2 minutes. Okay, cool. So I guess that brings us to where we're at right now. We have the report. We know roughly what we need to do. Getting things done I'm finding out, is a lot harder than maybe you think. So we're looking into some funding with DPE, Department of Planning and Environment, and some early works that we can do without needing to do too much of the planning and environmental impact assessment requirements of doing long sections of fences, to just do some access improvements underneath the bridge. And the recommendations were, you need to have some dry access requirements for most water levels. This is a tidal river, and during the recent floods, I know that the water got up to basically everyone's heads in that photo there. Obviously an unprecedented event, but we'd be looking to put in a concrete ledge in that top photo that's around about the same height as that drainage box there, which would allow access for things during, I would think, most water levels. And there's an example of that from the Pacific Highway upgrade in a dedicated culvert in that below photo. And then on the other side, I don't have a photo of it, but it's just that typical large riprap scour protection stuff. So we'd be putting in some smaller rock to infill that, just to make sure that things with small feet, like koalas, can comfortably cross. And then in terms of the next steps, to get a fence of that length in, obviously we need the correct environmental assessment and planning requirements fulfilled. Typically, a project like this would probably be we'd be doing one of our REFs, working under Division 5.1 of the EP&A Act. However, anyone that's ever worked in and around coastal wetlands knows that that is a bit of a spanner for our typical planning process. So we're currently looking into how we can develop within that state environment planning policy without needing to go through the huge EIS process. But if we can sort of progress that and get something over the next year, I don't know, maybe we can start construction the next year, and that would be the fence part of the project. And just to finish, I've put cameras out. I've had them out there for about a year now. So we got a few photos of things, both under the bridge, some things that would be quite scary to hit, like that deer. And then we got a great photo of a koala, and then also things using the culverts too. And I had a photo of an echidna and I forgot to slide it in there, but that was just from the other day. And that's it. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Brenton. Once again, a wonderful presentation. If you've got any questions for Brenton, please see him at lunchtime or ask a question via the Slido QR code. Our last presenter before lunch is actually going to talk about linear reserve type that we actually haven't spoken about as yet, and that of course is energy easements. And we actually have representatives here from Essential Energy and also Ausgrid. But we're going to have a presentation here from Paul Crawford from InfraVision. And he's going to talk about use of drone technology for overhead electricity line management, eliminating impacts to vegetation, the environment in sensitive environmental locations. Paul.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I do have to acknowledge that I am hard up against the lunchtime break, so I've got the shift. I'm sure that everyone wants to get out of here, but I really hope that in the next 15 minutes I can share with you some really interesting technology that really, I guess, runs off the back of a lot of the presentations that we're seeing this morning. And I have to call out straight up that my background's aviation. So I was 32 years in commercial aviation. Came across to InfraVision just 18 months ago. And I think it was David that called out at the start of his presentation this morning that he felt like a bit of a fraud. And then I listened to this amazing presentation, and I've got to say that coming from aviation, sitting here this morning, looking at what we're doing within InfraVision and the technology we're introducing, it's just really reaffirmed for me, you know, some of the programs that we've been working on and some of the technology that we've been developing over just the last 2 years. And I think it was Rodney in his presentation was talking about some of the initiatives which for me, coming into the industry so fresh, I was quite amazed that it's really only been the last 30 or 40 years that a lot of the initiatives have been out there. And what I'm going to talk to you about is really some of those initiatives that we've brought on board just in the last 18 months to 2 years. So the focus for InfraVision, and I'll just say this up front before I get into some of the visuals that I think will explain what we actually do. The challenge for us is that we're looking at helping the world accelerate to net zero in 2050. How do we do that? By introducing technology that's going to solve some of the energy industry's biggest problems when it comes to construction. We do that by introducing new technologies such as the drone, UAS, in carrying out new techniques which are safer, which are greener and are more efficient. And within doing that, we also find a lot of other use cases, and I'll talk about some of those today. The big challenge is that number one there, that to get to 2050 and net zero, the world really has to build around 16 million kilometres of transmission lines. And I think there was a picture up there, it may have been from yourself, Neil, of an energy easement early on, which showed the clearing of that energy easement. And that was just one picture. 16 million kilometres of transmission lines are going to go up around the world by 2030, 400 times around the globe in energy easements being rolled out. And the reason for that is to be able to connect the renewables to the grid. So one of the biggest challenges we have is the fact that we're building an enormous amount of solar, enormous amount of wind, which generally, by virtue of what they need to attract, being sun and wind, they tend to be built in areas which are outside the existing transmission infrastructures. They have to get connected. And the other part of the problem is having to actually uprate and use our existing infrastructure and transmission and distribution grids to its full capacity. So they're the two problems, and that's why InfraVision was created around about 3 years ago, to start using climate technology, with the drone being the enabling piece. What's been fantastic is that we've been able to work with some really great partners, and I've got to call out straight up that working alongside Ausgrid on a number of projects over the last 12 months has been a real pleasure, and I'll get to share you some of those projects with you this morning. The status quo is up the top. Typical transmission or distribution line string uses manned aviation, the helicopter that you see there, and also the lines people who are up in EWPs or bucket trucks. In the centre you can see a sensor being installed on a line, again utilising EWPs and working at heights. And on the right hand side, similar picture to what you saw earlier, a traditional energy easement that's been cleared. Down the bottom you'll see the drone technology on the left hand side that we use to string the power line. And the best way to describe it is really to, if you were to imagine you're building a house, renovating a house, the electrician comes in, runs in that lead line in the wall, and then the panelling goes up and you're left with the bit of line that you can then pull through the cabling with. That's essentially what we do out on energy easements. In the centre you can see one of our bird diverter installations, and I'll show you a bit of a video of that in a moment. Again, eliminating the working at heights risk and deployable grid scale very quickly. Down in the bottom right hand corner is actually the system that we use. So that's what we call the TX system and some of our drones, and I'll show you a bit more about that in a minute. I am going to share with you a number of videos in a second, but I think this picture really does show the difference that technology can make out there. On the left hand side is a transmission line that we installed last year utilising the drone technology. It's running parallel to an existing line that was built probably 30 or 40 years prior to that. And you can obviously see the outcomes by utilising some of the different technology that is around today. As I mentioned in the previous slide, bird diverters is one of the use cases that we've actually used the drones for. I would say not a month goes by when we don't realise or get asked the question, could you use drones for this? You know, and there's so many use cases out there. And we really see drones as being able to be a tool of trade out there. And that's really what our hope is, that it becomes a tool that's deployed right throughout the energy industry, especially within construction, that allows these new techniques to be used continually in especially a lot of that rollout of the 16 million kilometres of transmission lines that are going to be happening around the world. As I mentioned, bird diverters is one of the products that we have, and here is Kooragang Wetlands, which is up around the Newcastle area. We were called by Ausgrid to carry out an installation of around about 200 bird diverters. The Ash Island area, home to over 200 species of bird, including the black swan. There'd been a number of significant bird strikes with the existing distribution line that ran through that area. And I'll play a short clip now just to show you how that technology is used. Hopefully. So there you can see just one of the use cases of the drone technology, and I think a fantastic one. As I showed you in some of the pictures previously, a lot of that work is traditionally done using people in EWPs and bucket trucks, and obviously there's a significant reduction in safety, which is a fantastic outcome and something that we can deploy at scale as well. The next video I'm going to show you is a video again with an Ausgrid job that we had. It was a job that required the relocation of an existing distribution line. It was across a number of areas of private land up in the Upper Hunter area.
The reason they're rerunning this line or rerouting this line is for bushfire prevention.
Graham Francis, Regional Manager of Northern Region, Ausgrid. As you'll see out in the back of us, it's pretty hilly country. Today we're able to bring in InfraVision and fly the draw lines across to a pole located up on the hill there. We're going to have this conductor replaced out pretty well in half a day, so big saving in time. In addition to that, as you'll see, there's trees up through that section of the line, which would normally have to be cleared out so we could get that line through. With the ability to fly the draw line in, we can go across those trees and not have to remove them. So some big savings there. So good advantages.
If we didn't have the drone, we would only have two options there. One was to cut a lot of trees down to make a track through there for the wires to be hand walked out. Twice as many trees to cut down to pull out by hand, or we'd have had to get a helicopter in and try and fly it in. Helicopter brings in a lot of risk. Bigger machine, noisier, there's a lot more danger to the area. But the drones come across, it's a lot quieter, it's a lot safer, it's a lot more easier to manhandle, and it was just better for the property as well, with cattle and wildlife in the area. There's no great big noise. A lot cheaper and more effective to use a drone than a helicopter.
We're always looking at opportunities to bring in, new innovative technology within Ausgrid. This is a classic example of where we've started to use it. You can tell there's quite a high level of expertise amongst InfraVision flying the drone today. Quite a setup, and I have to say I'm pretty impressed with the equipment they've got. The drone, no problems at all. It was able to carry that line across, full control the whole time, and right into guiding the line in to some guides up on that other pole there to drop the line into. It went like clockwork. It was quite well.
I can see this being the future going forward, saving us a lot of man hours and risk for personnel trying to walk it out.
It saved having to make great excavations and less invasion on less ground disturbance. It's really good to see that they've gone along the right environmental processes.
A good capture of the innovative technology of drones and good use of it in this project. So fantastic outcome.
So as you can see there, another great use case of the use of drone technology. And I'll just quickly go to one of the ones that was really quite challenging for us, and that was actually carrying out a disentanglement of overhead wires. Again, a great call from Ausgrid to get us out there, design up a solution.
It is the ultimate high wire act in a world first. Australian drone technology is being used to keep the lights on by helping power companies untangle a major problem, and the idea has taken off.
On these tangled lines hangs the power of 70,000 homes in Sydney's north. Dangling over dense bushland, they were twisted by high winds, inaccessible to mere mortals, requiring precision surgery from above. Ausgrid ordering in reinforcements before the lines sever and lights go out.
To overcome this challenge, we wanted to explore some of the best technology that existed on the market.
Enter the drone. This is no ordinary drone. In fact, it was designed specially for this mission by Infravision.
We do a lot of in-house research and development to build bespoke bits of gear to solve problems for our customers.
The hooks are 3D printed and lowered to grab the wires, strong enough to bear the weight, precise enough to untangle, cheap enough to be sacrificed.
There's a whole lot of engineers in the background that came together to do something that's never been done before.
This technology is essentially the combination of brain surgery and rocket science, and not limited to untangling wires. They're capable of saving wildlife and trees and restoring power during bushfires. The sky is the limit.
Utilising uncrewed technology and automated technology, we can basically transcend those risk barriers and do good for the environment at the same time.
And it's all made and designed in Sydney, right above our heads. Tom Saker, 7 News.
I think some embellishment by the media in that one. Just slightly. Look, just very quickly, this is the equipment that we actually build here in Australia. That trailer at the back there is built up at our factory in Coolum Beach. Terrible place to have a factory. The drones, we integrate with a lot of different drones out there. There's the system itself, which you saw in the footage. That's the inside of it. We've got drone compartments, we've got charging stations for the batteries. We get out there on the energy easements with a really small footprint. And just to finish off, Ausgrid again rang us one day and said, look, we've got this span, it's around 1.5 kilometres long. Do you think the drone can do it?
So we just completed the single longest drone flight pulling line across the span, just over 1,400 metres, and successfully connected to the conductor, ready to be pulled back. Mission success. Yeah, it was unreal to watch. Yeah, very controlled, and Infravision were very professional in what they'd done, and a lot of expertise was excellent.
All right, well, thank you very much. My pleasure to give you a little bit of an insight into the work that Infravision does and let you see some of those great projects we did with Ausgrid. As I mentioned at the start, we really see drones as a tool of trade, and we can't wait for more and more of them to get out there and solve a lot of the problems that we've been talking about today. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks very much, Paul. And look, that's very exciting technology, and you can see all the benefits for the environment in that use of technology. We now have lunch.